Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. We should also ask the prayers of our Holy Father among the saints, Saint Dorotheos, Abba Dorotheos of Gaza, that he will guide our conversation and help illumine our minds, so that we can really benefit from this work of his, which I think is an amazing work. As I said, hopefully in the future you'll be able to have a copy of one or two of the lessons that we'll cover in a session, so that you'll have had time to kind of read it over. Partly, well, there's a few reasons why I think this is a good book to be done. So the book that we're talking about, for those who didn't maybe get the email, is this book right here, Abba Dorotheos of Gaza, Practical Teaching on the Christian Life. This is a wonderful translation done in 2000 by Constantine Skouteris. I think that's how you pronounce it. He was a professor at the University of Athens.
And that virus database has been updated.
And he, I think, as I understand it, reposed of cancer maybe around 2010. And so this was a wonderful work that he's sort of left for us sort of English speakers. And you know, it's a very readable translation, which, you know, is a really big deal, because a lot of the times there's many great books in Greek, but they don't often get rendered, or let's say the other way around. Often, you know, there are many instances when they're not rendered well into English, and it really, unfortunately, doesn't do justice to the words of the books, and especially when they're, you know, of the words of the saints. But in this case, I think he's done, you know, a wonderful job, and the footnotes are good. The glossary is extensive. You know, that's just the sort of physical product of this book itself. But the reason why I'm recommending Abba Dorotheos, and why I think, despite the fact that we're talking about a 6th century monk in Gaza, I'll give you some sort of biographical details in a minute, but that the character of these practical teachings on the Christian life are so fundamental and so obviously directed for all Christians, not just for monastics, that I think it's an amazing text to begin to work on forming our minds in living the Christian life and understanding what it means to sort of put that in practice every day. To give it just a bit more of a background to how I chose this, I've recently become involved with a group here at the university called Orthodox Christian Fellowship, OCF. And you know, they were sort of toying around with the different ideas about what we might be able to do as a study. And a lot of them thought, well, because this is what other groups have done, well, we should do a Bible study, because this is sort of what people do, right, in these kinds of groups. And while I wasn't sort of opposed to the idea, yeah, it raised sort of an interesting point, I think, that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and I think is maybe helpful for all of us in terms of thinking about these texts, which is, you can read the Bible, as many people do, and yet take a very wide variety of interpretations from what the Scriptures say. And as I think you've learned over the past few months and years that you've been carrying this out, but certainly as long as I've been involved, and Father John has been involved, but I'm sure Nico has been doing these sorts of things, you see how often we refer to the Holy Fathers to sort of guide our interpretation of the things that we're doing. While this seems to be the most natural place to begin, I think it raises the challenge in our particular day and age that the Bible maybe has been used in so many different kinds of ways that while we might consider the reading of it to be very straightforward, which I think it is, It presupposes, I think, something more fundamental, which is the Bible is very straightforward, um, especially if we have the right eyes to see it with and to read it with. And this is why we spend so much time sort of referring to the Holy Fathers, in the Orthodox tradition in general. And really, it isn't something we can kind of take for granted, because even very devout people, we might say, from other traditions or denominations or whatever outside of the Orthodox Church, when you speak to them and you think you may be able to sort of have a common way of speaking with them, even if they're sort of traditionally minded in their own groups. I had this experience myself. You see there's so many fundamental differences, and one of which is just the way that they relate to the history of the church, which is the idea that we know better than they knew then. And the whole idea of sort of orthodoxy is sort of works the opposite way. They knew better than they know now, and we're struggling to see things as they saw it. Doesn't mean we turn off our sort of critical faculties, as it were. But what it does mean, I think, especially in our day and age, where we're surrounded so often by a mindset that is profoundly not orthodox, whether it's secular, whether it's other denominations or things like that. This is what we experience most of the time, unfortunately. And so I think it's even more that what we do is make sure we're sort of cultivating this sort of basic Orthodox mindset, and that we're putting the faith into practice. And as we'll see when we encounter Abba Dorotheos, it will be through doing that we'll gain a sort of a new and a profound understanding of the Holy Scripture, and maybe in ways that we have never experienced it before or thought of it before. And so that's sort of my basic reason for wanting to do a book study on a text like this, is precisely because it can kind of lay this foundation for us, so that we can continue to do the kinds of things that we're doing, with the homilies on the Gospels and all of those kinds of things. But that we can also kind of see the very sort of straightforward way of what it means to put the commandments into practice, and to actually live our faith. And so that's sort of by way a little bit of an apology, as it were, for why we would look at this. The other reason why I really would like you to be able to sort of put your eyes to this text is because I had such a good response last week, both from students that were in this group, professors that were there, people from a whole bunch of different kinds of backgrounds, all Orthodox, but still, that they expressed to me they were moved so deeply by the text that it really moved in the sense of it. There were moments when it shook them up. There were things that challenged them. There were things that they had never thought of, or new ways of kind of seeing the world, or sort of questions and challenges with, well, how do I deal with this in my everyday setting? And so for that reason, I really would like you also to sort of be able to encounter the text rather than just having me speak to you about it. But for tonight, this is how we'll begin. I'd hope to speak to you both about humility, which is lesson 2 actually, and lesson 3, which is on the conscience. But I think we'll confine it to one, humility, just for time's sake. Just because as I was going back through the material, I realized I think it would be a little bit much to cover both. Before we hop into it is, why are we reading a text? Maybe I sort of covered this a little bit. I'll just sort of repeat it in case it wasn't. Why are we reading a text from the 6th century, from an abbot writing to his novices? And I think this is sort of the basic reason, this is the basic question. Why read any monastic literature? Why read things written by monastics? It calls, the sort of fundamental question that some people do ask. Why visit monasteries? What does that have to do with me? And I think the point, and Abba Dorotheos himself actually makes it in one of his lessons, is that the same, and we've repeated this before, but the same call to live out the gospel for the monastics is the same call for us in the world. The only thing that's different about that is exactly how it's done. But it's the same call to, take up our cross and follow Christ to the point, of doing everything that we can to love God with all our mind, soul, strength, and heart, and the other commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is what the monastic life aims at doing, and this is what we're aimed at doing in our lives. And so for this reason, we can read and benefit from these monastic texts, especially texts like in this context, where what we have is, an experienced person in the spiritual life writing or speaking, because this is how these talks were given orally, speaking to his spiritual children, speaking to beginners in the faith, speaking to people that are sort of all the way along the spectrum. But for that reason, they're very practical even for us, and I think you'll see that as we begin to go through a little bit. So the question why read monastics is the answer is because it's the same life that we're all called to do. And sometimes in reading the monastics, we can find ways to apply things to our own situation. We can find ways to be inspired. It can recharge our spiritual batteries, even though we know we're not necessarily going to go out and apply it the same way that they're applying it. The principles that are being spoken about are things that we can apply in our everyday life very easily. And I think we'll see this with Abba Dorotheos especially, even more so than other monastic texts. The final thing I'll say is, in terms of why I think it's good for beginners and people at all different stages, this, for me, actually was sort of a bit of my catechism, you might say. In my early formation, one of the things that I spent doing wasn't actually reading the text, was listening to the text. It comes with a CD with an audio version of it, and I think at the time I was, I don't know, painting a house or something. And so what did I do? But I put this on for a few hours and just listened and really, absorbed this whole way of seeing the world that for me at the time was so different. And I think, all of us, may have this same experience when we encounter this, because so often, even if we are Orthodox, we get caught up with the things in our everyday life, and sometimes we don't see things so clearly. So, God willing, Abba Dorotheos will help us with that. So, in this book, there's a nice introduction. I'm always sort of wary with introductions to books. Oftentimes they, aren't worthy of the text. Let's put it that way. But in this case, he's put together a very nice introduction, and he says some wonderful things about the monastic life in general, and then also about Abba Dorotheos' background. So again, to sort of convince you that that the monastic life has something to speak to all of us, I'll just read you what's in this introduction, a little piece. In the life of the Christian Church, the ascetic life is expressed in an absolute way by monasticism. The monastic life, though, is not independent of the life of the Church. On the contrary, it is flesh from flesh of the Church. It is the living out of the Christian message with enthusiasm and complete devotion. And he'll actually go on to begin to say, in the earliest formation of monasticism, what you basically had were Christians living just as Christians within their own communities. And they would do this to greater or lesser extent, depending on their strength and depending on their situation. We read this in Acts, when we see what did the early Christians do. Well, they went and they gave all of their possessions to the apostles to allow the apostles to distribute them as they saw most appropriate for the community of believers. And so this is in the early life of the church, this is the kind of stuff that we see. And when we read, for example, the St. Paul's letter to Timothy, when he's speaking about the old men, the young men, and the women and the virgins and widows and different things like that, we start to get a sense of, okay, there are communities within the community, as it were, that are carrying on some of these practices that are beginning to be sort of hinted at here, but which were sort of the general practice of the church. this begins to develop as he mentions in the introduction, for various reasons. And it starts very early, but we can say there's sort of a definite movement by the time we get to St. Anthony the Great, right? We've all at least heard of St. Anthony the Great, and his reputation as sort of a father of monasticism, which he was in the 2nd century. And so, even in the life of St. Anthony, we see that the way he also began his monastic life was that he began by living close to his own city. He didn't sort of go off right away, because this was the sort of early practice of the Christian church, which was this tradition of living somewhat ascetically, but still close to the community. As this kind of develops, for various reasons, from persecutions, from a desire to leave behind some of the worldliness, we might say, that begins to creep in as time goes on. But more especially, like in the case of St. Anthony, what we see, and we read it in his life, he was so convicted by the words of the gospel. Go and sell all that thou hast and give to the poor, and come and follow me. The word of the gospel hit him with such power that he immediately went and sold all that he had. He was very rich. His parents had reposed already. He provides for his sister to be with, you might say, a forerunner of a female monastery or something like that. And she herself did go on to become a great abbess in a very large female monastery. But he provided for her, and then he went to live this kind of life of complete devotion, not because of persecution, but because of the love of Christ that had lit a fire inside of him. And this is the beginning movement of this kind of desert monasticism, we might say. But even St. Anthony wasn't the first. He goes into the Egyptian desert, and as is related here in the introduction, he says something like there was something like already 5,000 people living disparately throughout the desert at this time. And so we can kind of see that this is a movement that begins sort of very early. So in the early form of it, you have basically hermits. And you see this in St. Anthony's life. You see it in the lives of the Desert Fathers, all of this kind of stuff. They basically live as hermits. And occasionally we may hear stories of visitors sort of finding them or coming and asking them for a word for their salvation. And it's basically spiritual advice. This is how things are in the Egyptian desert. Now, this begins to spread, not only through Egypt, it starts to spread to Palestine and through all these different places. The influence of the monasticism that starts here in the Egyptian desert is so far-reaching even that they were reading even in monastic communities in Ireland texts of the Desert Fathers and different things like that. There's a wonderful little book about that sort of shows this connection. I mean, this was spreading in the same way that the preaching of Christ spread with the apostles, so was this sort of flourishing of monasticism at the time. And so while it began in this one form of this sort of hermetic life as hermits, it also began to take on different forms. One of those forms was what we might call sort of the lavra, or sort of skeet life maybe, which was you'd have a bunch of monastics who lived maybe a certain distance apart from one another in their own sort of cells, their own buildings or huts or something, a small dwelling place. And once a week, they would all come together to a common church in order to take part in the divine services sort of together. And we see this spread out from St. Anthony and from Egypt. For example, in the disciple of St. Anthony, St. Hilarion the Great, taking this to Palestine, and we're beginning to sort of see this being established in these other places. The sort of cousin to that, we might say, the next sort of step to that, is the kind of monasticism that most of us would experience if we went to visit a monastery today, which is Cenobitic monasticism from kinovios, like common life. And so what did they have? Well, now, not only was it a group of monastics with a church in common, but it was the monastics living together in a particular monastery, in a particular building together, and holding all things in common. They had common meals, they had common services, they had common, work. They had everything in common in the sense they didn't have own property. All of these kinds of things, and this is the kind of monasticism that we encounter most of the time today. But this is also the forerunner of Abba Dorotheos, because Abba Dorotheos also lived in Cenobium, or lived with this Cenobitic, this common life monasticism. And so the ones to really sort of introduce this in Egypt are Saint Pachomius, who many of us have sort of heard the names at least, and in Palestine Saint Theodosius. And this, we're still talking very early, 3rd, 4th century, this sort of development of this form of monasticism, and especially into the 5th century. So that's sort of by way of the tradition that Abba Dorotheos is sort of coming out of. All of us maybe know of this sort of, more or less, but I just wanted to kind of run over a few of those things, as well as sort of making the point again, that is being made in this introduction. And I'll just read you a portion of it. Dr. Constantine says, which I think sort of sums up the whole thing: the monk faithfully applies the Gospel's teachings in order to become an incarnation of Christ's law. I mean, you can say that this is what the monks were doing, but I mean, this is the goal of every Christian, right? Is to faithfully apply the gospel teaching so that we can become like Christ, so that when Christ sees us, he will recognize himself in us, and he will, as it says, Christ is the good shepherd, and he knows his sheep. Well, he knows them precisely because we become like him, so that he can sort of recognize that image within us and likeness within us. Oh, sorry. Someone's calling for me. So into Abba Dorotheos just sort of briefly, and then we'll go through the text. Abba Dorotheos is born around 500 AD. We don't know his exact birth date and death date, but sometime around 500 AD. They believe he was from Antioch, and that he was from a Christian family. We know for certain that his brother was very wealthy, and that he supported the monasteries a lot. As well, the sources for his life are from very many different places, and we've sort of collected them together in order to sort of see the full picture of Abba Dorotheos. And that's why some of these details, aren't all sort of fleshed out for us. But we do know both from that and from his own lessons and letters. So this is an interesting feature of Abba Dorotheos. A lot of the time, like many spiritual fathers, they speak from their own experience. And so, if you've read the new biography of Elder Joseph, you see how often he was teaching his synovia, his brotherhood, based on what he experienced when he was young, based on this or that story out of his own life. And so this is also a source of our information about Abba Dorotheos, because he tells us about different things. One thing he mentions is how much he loved to study. He was very studious, and it seems quite clear, both from the work itself, but also from the other sources, that Abba Dorotheos was educated. They believe he was educated under Procopius of Gaza, who was a philosopher at the time. But Abba Dorotheos didn't spend long in those pursuits, because he became a monk very young. he entered a monastery in Gaza, the monastery of Abba. And at this monastery were two very famous spiritual fathers, two very great saints of the desert, Abba Barsanuphius and Abba John the prophet. And so he had the very great benefit not only of having the abbot of the monastery, Abba Seredos, but also of these two great saints of the desert, basically as spiritual fathers. He begins his own monastic life as the guest master, and he relates some very interesting stories, which is, again, a benefit of living in community, which is he used to, his responsibilities were so many as a guest master, and he was so exhausted that when he needed to wake up for vigil, he couldn't do it. So what he had to do is he had one of the fathers who would wake him up and make sure he got up to go to the service. And then at the service, he had another father who would basically sort of poke him in the ribs every time he started to doze off in order to kind of wake him up and keep him attentive. And these are the sort of interesting things that you see. You know, when a person loves the spiritual life and loves the faith, they find ways, they find tricks, whatever it takes in order to be able to sort of pursue this. And so many times that's us relying on the people around us to sort of help us do this, and we can kind of engage in this common struggle together. So he goes on. He becomes the head of the infirmary there at the monastery, and also basically a nurse. And so there's also some suggestion that he had some previous study in medicine. So as we said, he was, you know, fairly well educated for his day. Now, he himself actually wanted to go become a hermit, and he had gone to Abbas Barsanuphius and John to ask for the blessing, and they basically told him no. As it says here, Barsanuphius comforted Dorotheos, who could not follow a strict ascetic life due to physical weakness, saying that spiritual continence or self-control and humility have greater importance than bodily exercise. This is, you know, particularly applicable for us, right? When we compare ourselves to the monastics, and when we can sort of feel the temptation to think, oh, well, what can I achieve? These people give their whole lives to do this. They're praying in vigils all night long. You know, maybe you go to a monastery for the weekend and you're exhausted. And you think these people do this every day, all the time, and I'm exhausted after a weekend of it. How, you know, what hope is there for me? But the hope is right here that Abba Barsanuphius is sort of pointing out that it's not necessarily about the strict ascetic life, the sort of exterior part of the spiritual struggle, though that helps. But rather what's important is the sort of spiritual content of what that bodily work helps to achieve, which is the self-control and humility. And that's something we can all pursue in our day-to-day lives in various ways. Other than that, let's see, okay, Abba Dorotheos himself becomes a spiritual father to some younger monks. His most famous disciple is Saint Dorotheos. A wonderful story of it's amazing. They include as a life. It's only about 9 pages at the beginning of the work, and it's just a beautiful story about Dorotheos. But so Abba Dorotheos had, you know, begun to be a spiritual father after the repose of Saint John the Prophet in 540, and Abba Barsanuphius decides that he's going to keep complete silence. Abba Dorotheos, whether he's sent or whether he goes to the somewhere in the nearby area, and he founds another monastery. And so likely this is sort of a common practice with monasteries, that they send out, you know, a brotherhood, a smaller brotherhood, in order to sort of grow other communities, especially when space becomes tight. And so this is what he did. And so it's at this point, St. John has died, Abba Barsanuphius is in seclusion. Shortly after Abba at Seridos, he also reposes. And the interesting thing, and it's noted here in the introduction, is that it's not until that point that Abba Dorotheos, who till that point considers himself fully to be a disciple still and under obedience, that he begins to speak publicly and to begins to teach and to hand on this sort of great wisdom that had been bestowed upon him. And I think that there's something sort of very wonderful in there that we can kind of we can take from that in terms of thinking about when it's appropriate to speak and when not. And and if a great saint like Abba Dorotheos will wait so long out of respect for his own spiritual fathers before he speaks, it's a great lesson for us who sometimes maybe feel that we want to speak even maybe when it's not the right time to speak. So it's something for us to sort of consider and at least be aware of. St. Dorotheos reposes, I think, sometime in the 550s, 560s, some say even as late as into the 600s. So his feast day is celebrated on the 13th of August in the Greek tradition, the 16th of September in the Slavic calendars. So that's sort of a basic idea of who is this person we're going to be reading about. One other thing I'm going to read from this introduction before we just plunge into this text. It's only it's maybe 10 pages that we have. It's not so long, but he writes about Abba Dorotheos and says, Abba Dorotheos' determined effort to keep the mindset of the Church is most characteristic of his writings. He is conscious that he is not presenting his own message, but is offering the experience of the Church as lived out by the great ascetics of both the desert and the communal monastery. And I think this really sums up what it is we're supposed to be aiming for as Orthodox Christians, which is to not be speaking from our own perspective, from our own thoughts about the way things should be and the way the world should be, but first to do what Abba Dorotheos does, which is as much as possible to try to understand and absorb the mindset of the Church and begin to look at our problems in our life or situations or joys, all of these things, first through the eyes of the Church, first through the mindset of the Church, so that we can appropriately respond and react to the things that sort of arise in our life, whether good things or whether the negative aspects, and always just sort of keep that principle before our eyes, as opposed to, I think, the modern world view, which sort of encourages us to make ourselves always the standard of all things, right? It's always me first, and maybe I'll sort of open the door to some of these other things. And this is a radically different way, which is to say, if I'm spiritually sick, and if my goal is to be healed and my goal is to be perfect, then how can I use myself in my illness as the standard when the standard ought to be that perfection that it is that I'm seeking? And this is what the mindset of the Church sort of holds out for us, and that is sort of identified in the writings of Abba Dorotheos. So, and that connection to sort of living links, these great ascetics that he refers to his own spiritual fathers, but also to those in that lineage that he is sort of connected to. And this is also sort of a very important attribute of our lives as Orthodox Christians, to be tied to these living links, and not just to books, which we do need and which are important, but for us to live out the faith and for us to find other Christians, other Orthodox Christians that are also living out the faith, and to become close with them, so that we can struggle together in community and find these spiritual guides that are doing the same thing. So that's by way of a comprehensive introduction. So to jump into the text itself, I'm just going to read you the very first paragraph of this second lesson on humility. One of the elders said, "We need humility more than anything else. and to be prepared to say, "Forgive me," upon hearing any word. All temptations of the enemy are destroyed by humility. Let us examine the strength of this saying. Why does the elder say that we need humility more than anything else, and not we need temperance more than anything else? Since the apostle says, "Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things." Why did he not say we need fear of God more than anything else, since the Holy Scripture says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom"? The Scripture also says, "By the fear of the Lord, everyone departs from evil." Why did he not say we need almsgiving or faith more than anything else, since the Scripture says, "Through almsgiving and faith, sins are purged"? Moreover, the apostle says, "Without faith it is impossible to please God." If it is impossible to please God without faith and almsgiving, and if sins are purged through faith, if one can depart from evil by fearing the Lord, and if the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and again, if the person that struggles practices self-restraint, why does he say we need humility more than anything else? Why did he leave out all the other virtues that are so necessary? I love this opening paragraph, especially because the first many times that I heard it were, as I said, in audio form. And you really, when you're listening to Abba Dorotheos, you can really hear that he was a public speaker. You know, he has these parallel questions. This why. You know, these are techniques for helping us to sort of grasp the subject and also to sort of be drawn into it. And so he asks us, you know, why did he leave out all the other virtues that are so necessary? I'll turn this one over to you as a question. I'm hoping someone will very bravely venture out an answer. Why does the elder say, in light of all of these scriptural quotes about faith, about almsgiving, about the fear of God, all of these things, why does he say we need humility more than anything else? He doesn't even quote scripture for that particular verse. Any ideas?
The humble don't want to answer, Papa, so.
I'm just taking a stab in the dark because humility is what casts out the devil.
Oh, there you go. She's already thinking ahead to the next paragraph, or 2 paragraphs from now. Yeah, very good. This is one of Abba Dorotheos' answers. It's not the first one he gives, but he goes on to talk about it as the second one. So let's hold on to that one, because we'll turn that over to the rest of the group to ask why does that work the way it works. But we'll see first. He answers and says, and unless anyone else wants to take a stab in the dark, why humility more than anything else? We've heard one answer which is correct, but we're going to hear another one if someone is brave enough.
Papa was going to throw it out there that if we have, that's keyword is if, any of the other virtues, but we don't have humility, then those virtues will lead to the opposite of humility, will lead to pride.
Yeah, so you're pretty much there, except the way he phrases it is the opposite way almost. So let's think about this connection to virtue. Abba Dorotheos answers and says, the elder wants to show us that neither the fear of God, or almsgiving, or faith, or temperance, or any other virtue can be achieved without humility. And this is why I say, sort of turning around what Nico was saying a little bit. It's not that these virtues will turn to pride. It's that without humility, these things aren't really virtues. Because they're not being done in a way that actually makes them virtuous. Because intention is the majority of what makes an action good or evil. Right? There's the exterior side to the actions. There's the exterior side to virtue. But the heart of virtue is our intentions in doing it. Which is why our Lord says in the Scriptures, not everyone who says unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. He's referring here to the fact that we can have all of these good deeds exteriorly, but if we don't have the heart of them, in this case the foundation of humility, if we're not doing them for the sake of God's will, for the sake of God, they're not really virtues. And that's sort of his or, you know, they're very partial, they're very, very exterior. It's not going far enough, let's say. In some case, it will cancel them out altogether. For example, when you know, you do something good, but you only do it to get praised. You don't actually do it because, you know, you want it to benefit someone. That's an example where you know, exteriorly you did a good action, but your motivations behind doing the action had nothing to do with it, and so it doesn't make it virtuous. Certainly not for you. It was a good action, but it wasn't virtuous. If you can understand sort of where the saint is going with this. So we need to have this foundation of humility, so that it will guarantee that our good deeds are being done for the right reasons and in the right way. So let me tell you a small story. I knew this young woman who you know, had become serious about her spiritual life, and had gone to a spiritual father to speak to them and to sort of ask them. And they'd been taking their spiritual life serious now for a few years, maybe, you know, whatever the amount of time, I don't quite remember. And they went to the spiritual father and they said, basically, where should I be? You know, I've been living the spiritual life for this much time. How many virtues should I have? You know, what things should I have mastered or not have mastered by this point? And I always sort of, you know, remember the response. The spiritual father kind of, you know, didn't much like that kind of a question, we might say. Not because there was any problem with the question, but because at the root of it was the sort of misunderstanding of what virtue is. And the spiritual father wanted to heal this before it turned into, you know, a potential problem. And so he says, none of that matters. It's not about counting how many virtues you've done. It's not about counting how many services you went to. It's not about, oh, I go to church every Sunday, or, you know, I did my prayer rule and this other person doesn't, or something like that. You know, I give this much money, therefore. It's not about any of that, as the spiritual father said. None of that matters. All that matters is humility, is having humility. And so even the contemporary spiritual fathers, maybe, are giving the same answer as Abba Dorotheos, as we would expect to find. The reason why is because it's true, you know, and it's true in experience. And it points to the problem that Nico was saying in his answer, which is many times these good deeds or these good actions, left alone on their own, can do the opposite. It can actually create pride in us. And this is what that spiritual father was trying to sort of jump on to say. There's nothing to do with that. That the root of it all is humility, and that's what's important. And so there's something I think also very freeing about that, which is it's not about how much we do, it's about how we do it. You know, again, that can be very encouraging for those of us who struggle and say, oh, I barely find time, or it's so difficult to do this or that. With this kind of a thing in mind, you know, it's not, again, it doesn't matter if you didn't have, you know, if you didn't spend, you know, 4 hours in prayer and all you could squeeze out at the end of your day was 5 minutes, you know, and you were fighting to stay awake the whole time. God sees the heart, you know, God sees the humility involved in that, and that's what makes all the difference. So at the end of that paragraph that I just read to you about the elder saying, you know, nothing is achieved without humility, Abba Dorotheos goes on to say, this is why he says we need humility more than anything else, and he adds, and to be ready to say, forgive me, whenever anything is said to us. And he concludes this little bit by saying, all the temptations of the enemy are destroyed by humility. So this was our first answer, I think, that was sort of getting at it. But that's perfectly sets up, because my question that I had written down in my notes was, well, what does this mean? What does it mean all of the temptations of the enemy, of the devil, are destroyed by humility? You want to answer? Why? Why? How is it possible that humility is so strong that it can defeat the devil, that it can defeat all of the temptations of the devil?
Yes, I'll speak by proxy, Papa, again.
Sure.
Because that's the only thing, I don't even like using that word, but that's the only thing the devil doesn't have, right? He doesn't have any humility, so if a person has real humility, that's what will burn him.
Exactly. The devil, is the archetype, you might say, or the model of all that is pride embodied. Very closely tied to that is vainglory. But pride is even worse than that. Because at least in vainglory, you're still sort of caring what other people think, and that's why you think so highly of yourself or try to make yourself so wonderful. But when you get to the level of pride, you actually don't care what other people think, and that's even more. It's even worse. And so exactly, this is the kind of thing that that Abba Dorotheos is getting at when he says that all temptations of the enemy are destroyed by humility. So right from the get-go, we can see humility isn't necessarily tied to having to accomplish great virtues. Humility also is, the most sort of fundamental way that we can destroy every temptation that comes in our lives. Every temptation that the devil can throw at us is to have this humility. So, right from the get-go, we're having this held out to us as the easiest way for us to live our Christian life. It's not easy in the sense of actually accomplishing it, maybe, but it's the most effective for getting us where we want to be in the shortest amount of time. Okay? We'll see in some of the other weeks, there's other things sort of connected very closely to humility. You might say obedience, or cutting off of your will. These are all other ways that sort of circle around the same kind of thing. But we sort of have this foundation, this base, which is humility. There's a wonderful story in the prologue about a disciple of St. Macarius, who there was a man whose daughter was demon-possessed, and he wanted the monks from the desert to come heal his daughter, but every time he asked them, they had too much humility to be willing to come and do it. Oh, no, you don't want me, you want this father. Oh, you don't want me, you want that father. And so someone had sort of told them, look, the best way you can do is, get them, when they're here selling their baskets, because that's how they had to support themselves, tell them, come back to my home and I'll pay you. And when the father's there, then he'll say a prayer for your family and bless your home, and it will heal your daughter. And so this is exactly what the man does. And so he finds a father who buys the thing, and the father comes home with him, and what does he do? Well, as soon as he walks into the yard, the demon-possessed girl runs up to him, and the demon slaps this monk in the face. And so what does the monk do? In his humility and in his obedience to the commandments of Christ, holding this quite literally, he turns the other cheek. And in that moment, the demon screams and comes out of the girl. And we see right there, the power of humility is so great that the demons can't even bear to be near it. It burns them. And so the demon flees. And this is sort of, these are the sort of wonderful things that we encounter in the lives of the saints that show us just how much power the simplest acts of humility have to drive the demons away from us, to drive temptation out of our lives, and to sort of free us from that. And so this is why we hear, for example, in the next paragraph, or another paragraph down, humility is very great indeed. Each of the saints walked in humility and shortened his journey by working hard, as it is written, look on my humility and my pain and forgive all my sins. And he sort of talks about the connection between working hard and having this humility. And he points out, which again is encouraging for us, if we cannot work hard because of our weakness, let us try to humble ourselves. I believe in the mercy of God that through the small effort made with humility, we shall also find ourselves in the position of those saints who labored and worked hard for the love of God. Yes, we are weak and we cannot work hard, but can't we at least humble ourselves? Right? Look, we find it hard to say our prayers. We find it hard, to think about God in our day. We find it hard to, remain calm when someone, insults us, or when someone cuts us off in traffic, or all of these kinds of things. Fine. Maybe that's hard for us. Maybe that struggle is difficult, and maybe we fail at it regularly, or most of the time. But at the very least, as Abba Dorotheos says, can we not humble ourselves? Can we not look at that situation then and say, I'm sorry, God. Look at me, and take stock of where I'm at, and at least in that, we can sort of turn the temptation of the devil on its head. So yes, the temptation came to us and we failed. But what did we do? Out of that temptation, we humbled ourselves. And so the devil tried to trip us up with a small thing, and we gained a greater thing. Because we already learned that humility is the whole foundation, that everything is built on humility. And so there was an opportunity for us to sort of achieve this virtue of humility, as it was. So yes, I failed in the virtue of patience, but instead I succeeded in the virtue of humility. And this is the kind of way we can sort of turn around all of these things in our lives. When we feel like I'm not strong enough to do these things, well, fine. Then say, God, I'm weak, help me. Right? And that action of saying, God, I need your help over and over and over again will create this sort of state of prayer within ourselves and this state of humility before God. And God is just there waiting to transform us, waiting to flood us with his grace, when we're in that position. And so that's why he says, as he goes on in the next paragraph, brethren, the person that has humility is fortunate and blessed. Humility is great. Quite rightly, a certain saint marked out the person who has true humility by saying, humility does not allow you to be angry or provocative, or to have boldness. He kind of goes through and talks about the connection of humility to anger, and how foreign it is. He says for the soul of a monk, but for the soul of a Christian to become angry. Because if we have this true humility, we won't be disturbed by these kinds of things when they come along. When someone insults us, what will we say? Well, I guess I deserved it anyway. Or maybe I didn't deserve it in this situation, but there was that other time when I did this thing, right? There are ways in which we can sort of, find ways to be victorious in these situations. Instead of answering back someone saying, you know what, well, I do this job way better than you do. We can just bite our tongue. All of these things are connected to this sort of humility, right? That sort of says, I'm living this out. I'm turning the other cheek by not saying anything, or that kind of thing. And in doing that, you get to the point that no matter what someone says to you, no matter whatever the situation is, we can get to the point where it doesn't cause this kind of agitation in our souls. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like these things when maybe someone said something to you, and we felt like, well, look, they had no right to say it to me. And what happens? So they did something that we feel injures us, and we go away from that situation, and we allow that to continue to injure us for hours after the fact. We keep thinking about it. We keep getting angry over again. We try to do our prayers, and we can't help but think about this person and that thing. How dare they say that to me? Or, I can't believe that they would do this to me, and I've only ever done this to sort of help them. And it stretches on and on and on. And in the worst cases, these are things that we hold on to and then end up never letting go. And so the damage that they did from this one small insult turns into this sort of mountain that can sort of determine the course of our whole lives, as it were, when you see families breaking up over small little fights or things like that. All of this can be avoided by having humility, by finding a way to say, you know what, this person's having a bad day. Or you know what, maybe I shouldn't have said what I said. Yeah, maybe it didn't warrant this kind of reaction, but if I had have done things a little bit better, maybe it could have avoided it. Or if I had done things better last time, maybe it could have avoided it. You know, and there's ways that we can, by finding a way to sort of excuse another person and take some kind of accountability, that we diffuse that agitation that would be there left in our souls, you know, maybe for a long time to come. And so these are the kinds of things. We're not going to be able to sort of get through all of this, but he mentions two kinds of pride, and then he'll go on to sort of talk about the two kinds of humility that counter this pride. And the two kinds of pride he mentions, the first pride is what he'll refer to as worldly pride. And that's the kind of pride, he says, when you despise your brother or your neighbor, when you humiliate them as though they're nothing, or you consider that yourself to be greater than them. This is the sort of worldly pride. And he attaches this to things like, especially when we do it over natural gifts that we have. I'm smarter, I'm prettier, I'm stronger. This kind of stuff, this kind of what he sort of connects as, you know, worldly kinds of things. I have a you know, better house or job or car, and you know, a lot of the time we do this subtly, right? It's like, sure, most of the time we're not like spitting on people and saying I'm better than all of you. That's easy, right? But it's not so easy when we sort of look inside of ourselves to see how many times do we have these like little seeds of a thought, you know, where you kind of think and you compare yourselves to other people. You put the other person down, you know, by saying, well, I'm just being objective. This is the kind of, these are the kinds of things he's also pointing to. This stuff is very subtle. And he goes on to talk about the second kind of pride, which he calls monastic pride, but which we would call spiritual pride. This is even more dangerous, right? Which is, you know, pride because, he says here, because you chant well, or because you know, you work with care, because you serve other people well, because you read your Bible, we would say, because you go to church, because you know, give alms, because you do all of these things, and therefore we have this other kind of pride, which he calls a sort of spiritual pride or monastic pride. We're proud about spiritual things that we do. So he points out these two things, and he's sort of, I think if we sort of consider it, we would see most of the things in our lives fall under one of these two groups. Either when I pat myself on my back because I think I'm really great, or, you know, when I sort of subtly judge other people. And sometimes that's also to make me feel better or whatever, but sometimes, most of the time, I think we just do it, unfortunately, without even thinking. And so he'll say the two ways to sort of combat this. The first is, he says, is to consider your neighbor or your brother to be wiser than oneself and to surpass one in all things. Simply, as that saint said, to be under everyone. This is a bit tricky, right? You know, like when St. Paul says, you know, the worst of sinners, you know, the sinners of whom I am chief, that kind of thing. You know, I think a lot of us, and as people have expressed it, you know, to me, and as I've thought of my own past, well, I'm not really the worst of sinners, right? I mean, come on. I'm not as bad as Hitler. I'm not as bad as, you know, this person or that person or whatever, right? So how can I do this first bit of humility of, you know, considering everyone else to be wiser than me and to surpass me in all things? But I heard a priest once say something I thought was very useful to think about. He says when we say, you know, that I'm a sinner, you know, and that I'm the chief of sinners, that what we're supposed to be comparing ourselves is not to the person next to us, because it's like comparing apples and oranges. The person we're comparing ourselves to is the person that God wants and expects us to be. The person that we would be if, when God opened the doors and said, "Come and follow me," we walked through them. All of those times in our day where God opens doors, where God says, "Come and follow me, come and do this, come and do that," and we don't do it. That's the person we're comparing ourselves to when we say, "I'm the worst of sinners." And in that way, I can say, I'm worse than everyone else, because I compare myself to myself and to what God wants me to be. And the fact is, as far as I know, the distance between where I am and where God intended me to be and continues to intend me to be is a huge difference, is a huge distance rather, compared to where God intended you to be. You know, you guys all did better than I did. What we do by starting to think like this is we stop thinking in a very worldly, kind of exterior kind of way, where we judge actions based on exterior, what's going on, rather than understanding that the deeper motivations that go behind that are really what determines the action before God. And so it's back to this, whether something is virtuous or not, whether an action is good or bad on the outside, or how good or bad it is, depends incredibly on how and why the action was done. And so Abba Dorotheos, what he's trying to do is give us techniques so that we can begin to stop judging people and begin to love them, to begin to turn inward and look at the struggles that we have, rather than constantly excusing the things that we have because of the actions of other people. I don't know if this is sort of making sense. That's the first thing, to sort of put oneself down. It's a technique, it can be very useful. It can be very useful. But there's a second kind of humility. And this overcomes the spiritual pride, but also sort of in general, I think. In some ways, this is more approachable for us as modern people, who maybe have a hard time with that first one. And he says the second kind of humility is to attribute all our achievements to God. So maybe we say the first one's unrealistic. Maybe we say, I just can't do it. As much as I try, I can't do it. Right? Well, we certainly can do the second one, can't we? Right? To attribute all of our achievements to God. To say it's because God gave me these gifts. It's because God arranged these situations. It's because God, entrusted me in this moment to be able to kind of do this and to use these gifts that He's given me to bring about this good thing. Can't we at least do that? And by doing that, we are constantly humbling ourselves. This is a form of humility, to attribute all the good things, all of these good things to God, and to give thanks continuously. And this, in some ways, is a more approachable way for some of us in the modern world, I think.
Papa, just a clarifying note. So if we're giving thanks to God, we're doing that internally, right, within ourselves?
Yes.
We're not going to other people say, well, God did this for me and God did that for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a clarifying note, okay.
Because then that can turn into this spiritual pride thing, right? The second kind of pride, and so yeah, this is sort of this is a great way to cultivate this relationship with God, because by doing this within ourselves, we're also it's a form of prayer, right? If every time we are sort of pleased with something in our life, if we immediately say thank God, whether sometimes out loud and sometimes within ourselves thinking about this more deeply, then we're also cultivating this remembrance of God throughout our day, this giving thanks for all the good things that He's given to us, to being aware for more opportunities for this to happen. Because when we're always looking at the almighty me, the I, we don't see these other things going on around us. We're not aware of them. But the more we spend time turning to God and saying, you, and thank you for these good gifts that you've given me, the more we begin to become aware of the things around us and of our neighbor and all of those kinds of things. So I think this is sort of a great way, for us as modern people to begin to sort of engage in the spiritual life. But the first one we should do as well, because we have a huge high opinion of ourselves as well. Okay? So we could spend some time with that as well, because to be honest, most of the time, at least in my own case, I think of myself as being much better than I ought to, and which is why I always justify myself, which is why it's so easy for me to say, when I get into an argument, for example, yeah, well, I did this because you. I did this because this. I did this because... We always have a because on our lips, right? And part of that is, thinking that I deserve this kind of justification. But most of the time, what happens is I'm putting someone else down in order to raise myself up, right? You did this, you did that, you did the other thing, and I was just reacting, right? And so we certainly can do more of this practicing of, before we speak, just try to stop and think and say, well, maybe I didn't do everything I could have in this situation, and the more we practice that, the easier it becomes to see the gifts and the strengths in other people, and the easier it becomes for us to say, I'm sorry, and forgive me in the situations where, we haven't done as well as we ought, or in every situation for that matter, because there's always more we could do, right? And we can stretch this as far as we can sort of bear it, but there's so much spiritual fruit that can come out of that, as we've just seen, the way that we begin to sort of cultivate this virtue as a habit. And so I'm going to sort of finish there. There's some other wonderful examples and things, and so I'll forward this along at some point so you can also read it. But what was I going to...
Abba, just while you're thinking there, we get a comment from the back, if that's okay?
Yeah, please.
I like that from the back. Okay, sorry, Father. No?
Yeah, okay.
He says he can hear me.
Yeah,
okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Father, so on humility, I find it sometimes very difficult on the number one, trying to practice that without kind of falling into despair and like depression.
Yeah.
Or feeling like I'm turning myself into a doormat. So do you have any advice on how do you cultivate that within yourself without falling into despondency or getting depressed?
Exactly. That's a very good point. That's why we have both of these forms, and we can kind of use them back and forth. And that's why I was sort of trying to suggest we can only use this as much as we can, because if it gets to these other places that are somewhat unhealthy, then we should stop immediately, especially despair. Despair is never from God, and actually the irony of despair for those of us and when we fall into it, the irony of it is the Fathers teach it's actually a form of pride, because it's believing that God isn't strong enough to overcome this in us. And so this is the sort of irony as we're trying to practice humility. We go so far that we actually can sort of fall into a state of pride. And so my main advice would be, if that's a particular struggle, then don't use that form. Use the giving thanks form. And that's why I say in our modern day, in some ways it's more approachable for people. But you can use the other form in ways, in small situations. So, for example, what's one way you might be able to sort of use the putting yourself down without it becoming unhealthy? Well, one thing that I've tried to do in the past, is when people would give me compliments. It's very natural to receive compliments. It's very nice to receive compliments at the same time, but those can be darts. The Fathers will teach us that can kind of wound us and can kind of build up the ego, which is what we're sort of afraid of. And so what oftentimes we can do, or what I've sort of done in the past, for example, when someone compliments me, I smile and I say thank you, and inside myself, with that little voice in my head, I say, no, don't you start getting puffed up. Like just something real quick, just like that. No, Yeah, or maybe you say in your head, yeah, because of God. You can't always say this to other people because it's not always appropriate the situation, and you know, you just couldn't say it. But you can always sort of do that inside as well. Say no, don't start doing that. And I think if we do it for these little things, by acquiring the habit of that, it can help to safeguard us in these larger situations, or situations that we find really difficult, where it's just we're struggling with how we should have maybe responded to another person, especially if it's a confrontation or if it's about work. I had this come up because, so much of, especially in the academic world, so last week when we were talking about this, is you having to sell yourself. You have to write these grant proposals. You have to talk about why your research is so important and it's the cutting edge and the best, and why you deserve the money over somebody else. And you're constantly in a situation where you have to kind of do that. And so this sort of came up as a question, and part of the thing that we found is it's okay to have to do that. It's okay to receive compliments from people and all of that, but we just have to, even if it's only inside of ourselves, say, remember who you are. Remember the way things really are. Don't let yourself, this is what we say to ourselves, don't become inflated, this swollen head. We can think of the saints, for example, and say, what am I next to them? Yeah, they didn't have all the things that I had, but they had the love of God. Or, whatever we can bear and whatever works for us. That's sort of the idea. And it's kind of a game in that way, a mental game where we are sort of fighting back and forth with it a little bit to find a way that's most effective for us, so that we feel the humility, but that we still feel good about the thing that the person said to us. I mean, that's fine. We should say thank God that they complimented us, for example, right? If only they knew the truth, or what,
Bob, let me quick question to ask you on that, because I was thinking about it. Vicky mentioned it. Why is it so hard for us, and I'll use Vicky's exact words, to be a doormat to somebody else? And again, it's humility, but on the other side, not to be taken advantage of, right? And if you look at the saints, in many cases, they were humble, but they weren't taken advantage of, and that's something it's a struggle.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
It's different for every person, and I think that's also part of the struggle. There are some saints, for example, when they were asked to give away their last cow that supported their whole family, they gave it away. Should everyone do that? No. Were these people saints because they did that? Yeah. Or it certainly contributed to it, in terms of that was the motivation for it. So the point is that every situation is unique. There are no recipes in the spiritual life in the sense of I can take exactly this formula and apply it exactly to myself, and therefore it works. It's like a prescription. Every prescription is individual. The medicine might be the same, but the dose, how many times to take it, when to take it, with what to take it, that's all different depending on the person, I guess. And so I think that's part of what's hard about this, because we can look at the lives of the saints and see them do it in very extreme ways and feel overwhelmed by that. We shouldn't feel overwhelmed by that. We should understand what they're presenting to us is a vision for what a human person can accomplish when we think we can't. And then we can go as far as we can without, without going past the breaking point, especially if we're prone to these unhealthy states, leave them alone. You work this out with the spiritual father, but if you find yourself constantly, any of us falling into this, leave it alone, even if it's for a time or whatever, and do the other form, which is, give thanks to God all the time. It certainly can be a safer way, maybe. Not safer is the wrong word. I don't know what the word is, but they both. It's like anything. You use, like when you're exercising, sometimes you use one machine, sometimes you use another machine. And it just depends on how your body's feeling in that day and how your workout's going. Same with the spiritual life.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Please do, yeah.
I guess this is piggybacking on Nico's question, but so does humility really mean being a doormat, or is there like a certain limit that a person can take?
Yeah. No, it doesn't mean being a doormat. Humility has nothing to do with the externals. When we talk about being a doormat, this is what we're talking about, the externals, right? Humility has to do with the state of your soul. It's how you see the world. It's how you see yourself in relation to the world. It's how you see yourself chiefly in relation to God. And so, so in that sense, I would say definitely not being a doormat. Does it mean in certain circumstances people are going to walk over you? Maybe. Like, that's something that a person has to discern within the will of God. You know, should that innocent monk have let the demoniac girl slap him in the face? And then, and you know, she probably didn't hit him lightly. And then he turned his face around. Shouldn't he have ducked? Shouldn't he have grabbed her arm? Shouldn't he have blocked it? You know, he was a monk, right? And this wasn't respecting, him being a monk, or, him being a clergyman, or something like that. You know, there are ways in which we can. There's no recipes, I guess, is sort of what it comes down to. But no, humility isn't being a doormat. Humility, I think Elder Joseph says it in one of his letters, is actually just self-knowledge. All humility is really knowing yourself. And if we really know ourselves, and we really know our strengths and our weaknesses, it's very easy to be humbled, because we see in our weaknesses something that can humble us, and we see before the strengths of our brother who have a strength in the area that I'm weak in, and I may have a strength in an area that they're weak in. But there's always an opportunity to say, thank God for this other person. You know, there's always an opportunity to say, I could be better, and not in the way that's just like, oh, I'm so terrible, but in a way that's like encouraging, like, there's work to be done, and I'm happy to continue working, kind of thing. And that's why we might say it's really what humility is self-knowledge. I guess I could read one more small thing that kind of sums up 2 points. One point I want to make is that they talk about humility isn't something you can really explain what it is. And he goes on for quite a bit to sort of say humility is more something that begins to sort of work on you, and when you have it, then you know you have it. Sort of. It's the kind of thing, and what he's sort of getting at is it's the kind of thing you learn by practice, and then suddenly you find that you're proficient in it, like playing a musical instrument or something. How did you suddenly learn this musical instrument? Was it because the teacher just sort of sat there and told you everything that it was? Well, no. Was that part of it? Yeah. Well, what was the other part of it, though? It was actually putting all of that sort of guidance as much as possible into practice. And for some weird reason, we go from, making these sort of terrible sounds on the guitar or the piano or the violin, to suddenly one day it actually sounds nice. And it gets sort of better and better the more we practice. And it's a sort of interplay between the things that we were taught, but, the sort of feel for it that we get. And if you said to me, well, what is playing an instrument? Or I asked you that, how could we really answer that? Like with a precise definition. Like you'd have to say, well, it's this and this and this, but you won't really know unless you do it. You won't understand what it is to play music until you start playing. And that's sort of the same thing with humility that he sort of points out. But the one I was going to read to you was a sort of, I don't remember now why I was going to read it, but it's a nice example. I'll read it anyway. I remember once when we were talking about humility, and one of the leading lights of Gaza heard us, saying, the more one approaches God, the more one sees himself as a sinner. Okay, what I was trying to say is that humility is self-knowledge, right? And knowing ourselves. And knowing ourselves in relation to God is the easiest way for us to feel humble. Right? Meaning, it's easy for us to thank God, and it's easy for us to overlook the so-called faults of other people, because we're aware of our own faults. All of this isn't in order to ground us into the dust. It's so that we can learn to love God and love our neighbor and appreciate them. Especially because by seeing our own lack, we see how much other people have to offer us, and we really value them then, and we really value God then. So he says, one of the leading lights, one of these leading citizens of Gaza, heard them saying, the more one approaches God, the more one sees himself as a sinner. He was surprised and said, how is this possible? Not knowing, he wanted to learn the reason. I said to him, Father, you who are the most important person here, how do you see yourself in this town? He answered me saying, I consider myself to be great and the first in the town. I said to him, how do you see yourself when you go to Caesarea? He replied, there I see myself as insignificant amongst the important men of the town. Again I said to him, how do you see yourself when you go to Antioch? He replied, I see myself as a peasant. I then said to him, when you go to Constantinople near the emperor, how do you see yourself? I consider myself to be a beggar, he said. After all this I said to him, look, this is what happens with the saints. The more they approach God, the more they see themselves as sinners. Thus when Abraham saw the Lord, he called himself dust and ashes. When Isaiah also said, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips. And so the idea is the more that we know ourselves in relation to what God wants us to be and in what relation to what God is, the more we can value all of the gifts that he gives us. The more that we can value our neighbor because of the gifts that they have to offer us and that we have to offer them. And the easier it is not to judge people, the easier it is to have this sort of spirit of humility, which will make the sort of doing of good deeds and of virtues so much within our grasp, and allow us to see that this is actually the essence of the spiritual life, and that God doesn't, call us all necessarily to be these great ascetics, but what God calls all of us to do is, to learn to become humble, and to live with humility towards God and towards our neighbor, for the sort of building up of the whole body of the church. So I guess we'll stop there because we've kind of gone on a little bit. Any other questions? Or this is a tough one. I think if I'll really try to get this out to you, because if you read it, it's very short. He gives all of these wonderful examples, and I think it really helps to kind of grasp all of the different subtleties of this topic, because it is a tough topic. How do we sort of find the balance? But the way to find the balance is maybe to try to find this sort of self-knowledge.
Well, we have one more comment here before we wrap up.
Sure.
Is it safe to say that if you accept that everything that happens to you is God's will, and God is all good, and everything he gives you is all good, so you can never really think of a doormat? Of humility, you're humble. Anything that happens to you is just God's love for you, so therefore it has to happen. So how can you think of yourself as a doormat after that? I think by saying you're a doormat is, I don't know, I could be wrong, is sort of having pride, because it's like the wife who accepts being beaten by her husband. She probably has more crowns in heaven for accepting that, as opposed to retaliating or leaving. You know what I mean? I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, that's how I see humility, as that if everything is from God and everything God wants us, is allowing that to happen. And if we allow it to happen, we should never even think we're doormats, because God is actually allowing it because he loves us. And I mean, I could be wrong here, but another thing is, I read a great quote recently, and it says, strip yourself away from everything. The only thing you have left is humility. So, I don't know. I just wanted to share that. I mean, I could be wrong about the humility thing, but I just kind of feel like if you just do what you're supposed to do, it's because God wants you to do that. Puts you in that situation.
Right. Well, you're half right. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, you're
half right. Wrong. Completely.
Yeah. The other part of it, though, is that because we have free will, that we have these situations where whether God is giving us something good or whether God is allowing a particular trial to happen, um, yes, the ultimate motivation for that is for our good. In the sense of, whether if it's a good thing, it's to help build us up. If it's a trial or it's a negative thing, it allows us to sort of exercise, the virtues or patience or love, kind of show our own sort of devotion to God. So from that perspective, yeah, we can kind of, we could say, sure, that we're not a doormat per se. But then there's the human side of sort of responding to that, and the human aspect of responding to these situations, very, very much depending on how we sort of experience them. And so, the other thing sort of with that is we can say, for example, we can say, well, this is God's will and it came from God and all of this kind of stuff, but we have to be careful because, most of the time we're not being spiritually aware enough to know what's actually going on in this situation. We're not aware enough of the motivations of God, for example, always to sort of know why we're experiencing the thing we're experiencing. And part of figuring out how to respond to something, and the sort of even the trial and error of doing that, from the human sort of side of things, is part of the whole activity, is part of what we're meant to learn and what we're meant sort of to teach us. So what I mean by that is to say every situation is extremely unique, and it's very difficult to say, like for example in the example you used about a woman who's being beat by her husband. On the one hand, yeah, we could say she's receiving crowns because she sort of is enduring this without herself becoming a murderer, becoming bitter, becoming poisoned by it. But to sort of say, as a general principle, for example, that that she would be expected to say in that situation, well, the reality is, in most of those situations, God is probably calling the person to get out of that situation, which takes an extreme amount of courage in order to do that. I'm not saying necessarily we're talking about sort of running for quick divorces or whatever the situations. I mean, these are extremely complicated situations where we would err on the side of get out of the situation and then sort of respond to them. But and so I wouldn't want to say, well, God is allowing this for you to just sort of endure, because some of the situations God is allowing it for you to step up and challenge, or to step up and remove yourself. Like sometimes the scenario comes where the response that God doesn't want is for you just to be a doormat. Where if we don't do what God wants, we will be just being a doormat. When in reality, what He wants us to do in many situations is to do the sort of courageous thing of standing up to that, for change and for the good of the whole situation. And so even in these cases, like that particular example, I mean, St. Paul talks about in the body of the church, that we separate members from the body of the church, so that they can basically come to repentance and be received back as sort of full members. And so in the situation that you cited, it may very well more than likely be that this is an opportunity for the woman to sort of take that stand, even make that separation, with the effect maybe that it actually fixes the situation as opposed to sort of perpetuating it. Sometimes what's required of us, and this is part of it, I mean, about humility, it's about having this sort of self-knowledge and knowing what to do, and sometimes that is speaking up. And that humbles us in the sense that it's very difficult for us to do, but that's what's required for us in the situation. So I guess that does come back to the doormat thing. Humility isn't always saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry," playing this sort of the false humility stuff that we talked about. "Oh, I'm terrible." That's not necessarily what it calls for. in some situations. Sometimes the humbling of our will that's going on is we have to do something uncomfortable that we don't want to do, and that may be speaking, that may be lots of different things. So I don't know if that kind of that's why I say half of what you're saying is right. God sends, God allows, but then there's the other half where he knows he's working with a free being, and he's sort of training them up, as it were, in this spiritual struggle.
Abba, we should wrap up, but we thank you for this introduction into Dorotheos, a very important spiritual book that we need to be having in our homes. And God willing, the next time, I'm not sure, a couple of weeks, whenever we regather for this specific topic, that hopefully we'll have the readings ready so that people can read them in advance, because we should be going to the next level now. Instead of being spoon-fed, that we need to be doing our part so that when we meet with you again, we can take it to the next level. If we could ask for your closing prayers, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Christ, the true light, who doth enlighten and sanctify everyone that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments, by the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother, and of all thy saints. Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.